I personally wanted to open this event to personally welcome the Middle East Institute's newest senior scholar, Dr. Charles Lister. Charles has been working on terrorism. He's actually been working on terrorism and insurgencies and non-state actors in the Middle East for some time, and I emphasize working because previous to coming to the Middle East Institute, he has been very involved in a Track 2 effort that has put him in direct contact with over 100 leaders of armed groups in Syria. So he has very much an in-depth experience with what he wrote his book about. So I think our talk today will be extremely interesting. His expertise on militias, on terrorism, fits in very nicely with what we're doing at the Middle East Institute, and he's a big addition. He's been busy, very busy in the few months that he's been here, briefing the Hill, briefing Congress, briefing the Pentagon, going to conferences overseas. You'll see a lot of his writings on our website. Go to it, look at it. I encourage you to do so, mei.edu. Charles' book, The Syrian Jihad, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Evolution of an Insurgency, was on sale at the door, and you can grab a copy on your way out. He'll stay for a while and sign it if you'd like. Our moderator for today's discussion is Dr. Paul Salem, MEI's Vice President for Policy and Research. Paul is also a prolific writer on the Syrian conflict, on broader Middle East issues. I think he's brilliant, but that's, I know many other people agree with me. So Paul will set the stage for Charles's talk, and we will open up following his remarks to your questions and answers. Thank you very much for joining us. Charles?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm flattered at the great turnout. Originally, I was going to give you a bit more of a blow-by-blow account of how the Syrian Jihad has developed and evolved over the last few years since the start of the Syrian Revolution in 2011. But I had a second thought that probably a lot of Syria events these days do exactly that. So I thought what I'd do, I'd take the opportunity today to actually give you a little bit more of an in-depth context from which to try and explain exactly why the Syrian Jihad today is the kind of phenomenon that it is. And there is a great deal of context which I think is very often ignored in that respect. But nonetheless, to open up the presentation, I will be keen to emphasize that Syria is now arguably home to the largest and most capable concentration of Sunni jihadist militants anywhere in the world, and almost certainly of anywhere in the world in recent history, in modern history. Whatever progress might be made in the fight against ISIS, and there certainly has been progress made in the last 18 months, massive instability will reign supreme in Syria for many years to come. And if there's one thing that we do know about jihadist militants in general, it is that they thrive in chaos. As of today, there are roughly 10 Sunni jihadist armed groups active in Syria. That includes an Al-Qaeda affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, and ISIL or Daesh, plus at least approximately 8 others. When I say a Sunni jihadist armed group, I'm talking about groups that maintain some element of a transnational objective or a transnational vision. They are not solely fighting for a Syrian national cause. When you get up to the 10 groups, anything after that, the line is blurry, but there certainly are other groups that we could potentially talk about in that respect. So there's a very serious issue that has developed in Syria, and it has not only implications for the trajectory of the revolution, as we've seen over the last 5 years, but also in terms of regional security, and now very clearly in terms of international security. So to the context I was talking about earlier, I devote at least, I think, 1 or 2 chapters to this in the book, and I call it Syria's flirtation with jihadism. In a sense, when you dig deep into the early 2000s, and also the late 1990s, what becomes quite blatantly clear is that the Bashar al-Assad regimes, quite specifically from 2000 onwards, had what I call a flirtatious relationship. I mean, more strictly speaking, it was a manipulative relationship whereby Sunni jihadist militants were allowed to flourish in certain areas when they became too much of a threat for Syria's national security. They were exported with Syrian military intelligence complicity to other areas of the country, essentially to almost fight on behalf of Syria's foreign policy interests. So I called my book The Syrian Jihad not just because of what's happening in the last 4 to 5 years, but precisely because of this context. We would not face the kind of jihadist problem in Syria today if it hadn't been for this context, which I will talk about. So to explain that in slightly more simple terms, I said at the beginning, Sunni jihadist militants thrive off chaos. You know, chaos developed very quickly in Syria through the eruption of the protest movement. And it's that kind of disenfranchisement, anger at the state system, and essentially the destabilization of government control that jihadist militants have all around the world exploited to their cause. But the infrastructure, which I'm going to come to explain, Syria was already home to an extensive jihadist infrastructure that had been developed and allowed to develop by Bashar al-Assad and specifically his Syrian military intelligence apparatus. And that is why, I argue, that is why we face the scale of the problem that we do today. The best example to explain this kind of flirtatious or manipulative relationship is the invasion and occupation of Iraq, which, as is well known, began in 2003. From the very first steps that US and other coalition forces took on Iraqi soil, Syria's Grand Mufti, who had been appointed specifically by Bashar al-Assad himself, Sheikh Ahmed Kaftaro, issued a fatwa at the very beginning of the occupation in which he declared it Islamically obligatory for any Sunni Muslim man or woman anywhere in the world, and in particular in Syria, to fight jihad against the US-led occupation of Iraq. From the very first days that US troops stepped foot on Iraqi soil, that had come from a regime appointed, the regime appointed overall head of Islam in the country. Within the first 11 days of the occupation, 5,000 Sunni jihadist militants, almost all of them Syrian and some Lebanese, had crossed from Syria over into the Iraqi border. Syrian military intelligence literally opened up the border gates. On the Iraqi side, Iraqi security guards had already fled because they were taken up with the invasion itself. Many of these first 5,000 were physically bussed in government buses from big cities like Damascus and Aleppo to the Iraqi border. And it was those fighters who gave birth to the very beginnings of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which, fast forward a decade, is the Islamic State in Iraq and al-Sham, or ISIS. I won't go into it so much in detail in this presentation, but many towns that you've probably become familiar with hearing them in the news were all centrally pivotal in those very beginnings of this kind of facilitative relationship. A key figure in mobilizing this early jihadist movement from Syria to Iraq was a man named Mahmoud Agassi, who's much better known as Abu al-Qaqa. Now, he has a very sort of shady history in Syria. Almost all Syrians you talk to nowadays, it's become an established truth that he was essentially in the pocket of Syrian military intelligence for many years before the Iraqi occupation. I spoke to a number of former security officials in Aleppo, which happened to be the city where he based himself prior to the invasion of Iraq. And a number of these officials I have quoted in my book. Abu al-Qaqa arrived in Aleppo in the late 1990s, almost certainly 1999. And I quote one police official who I will read out here, who described this man's arrival in the city, and specifically to his police office. He said to me, "The man was dressed like a Pakistani and barely spoke a word." Pakistani meaning shalwar kameez, basically shorthand. The man was dressed like a Pakistani and barely spoke a word. The officer spoke, he came with 4 military intelligence officers surrounding him. The officers spoke on his behalf. We were instructed to produce him a local ID card, a driving license, and many other documents for him, but without any registered address or any personal information at all. This was illegal in Syria, so we knew straight away, despite his youth and foreign appearance, that we were dealing with someone very important. It was only years later that we realized who we'd helped. So that very early, around 1999, Syrian military intelligence had accompanied Abu al-Qaqa into Aleppo. They had set him up with a mosque and provided him with all of the necessary documents that essentially allowed him to operate with a free hand in Syria's biggest city. By 2003, Abu al-Qaqa had developed a very, very significant following out of this mosque, the Al-Suhur mosque in Aleppo. By 9/11, Abu al-Qaqa, unsurprisingly, celebrated 9/11 as a victory for international jihad. He and his following, who by that time were known as Ghuraba al-Sham, held a big festival in the city to celebrate 9/11. They showed off the fact that they were providing military training to their recruits in the city. They celebrated Al-Qaeda's operations elsewhere in the world. There were a number of big screens set up in which Al-Qaeda videos were shown to the public. And for a time, some of that festival was aired on Syrian State TV. Now, unsurprisingly, this festival drew international attention and certainly regional attention. So what happened? Syrian military intelligence arrested Abu al-Qaqa and his deputy, a guy known as Abu Ibrahim, and they released him 12 hours later. No one knows quite what happened in that meeting, but nothing changed afterwards. Between late 2001 to the invasion of Iraq in March 2003, his following continued to grow. And by the time of the invasion, Abu al-Qaqa specifically was a key Syrian mobilizer for that mass flow of jihadist militants from Syria into Iraq. And considering his relationship with Syrian military intelligence, as I say, that flow was very much hand in hand. And as I say, many sort of supporting evidence is in my book for that. If we fast forward 3 years to 2006, shortly after the Syrian military's withdrawal from Lebanon, Syria, the regime in Damascus, had many cards, many gripes still to play in Lebanon, despite its withdrawal. At the same time, the US-led coalition in Iraq was placing increasing amount of pressure on Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State in Iraq by that time. So what we saw in 2006 was the beginning of a flow of militants back from Iraq into Syria. They were essentially fleeing the pressure that they were feeling by rising Sunni tribes and by the US-led coalition. And this posed a serious problem to the regime in Damascus. So what developed through 2006 and into early 2007 was a shifting or an exporting of this new threat, which they had basically created in Iraq, was a re-exporting of it to Lebanon, as I say, following Syria's military withdrawal from that country. Now, Syrian military intelligence, for a number of reasons, maintained quite extensive connections with two Sunni jihadist movements in Lebanon. One in the south of the country known as Azbat al-Ansar, and another in the north known as Fatah al-Islam. And the decision was generally made in Damascus to export the majority of these troublesome fighters that had arrived newly in Syria, to export them up to Tripoli, and specifically to the Palestinian refugee camp known as Nahr al-Bared. And it was there later in that year that we saw this group, Fatah al-Islam, bolstered by many of these fighters that Syrian military intelligence had facilitated to Lebanon, declare war on the Lebanese army. And we saw a 4-month war between the Lebanese army and this group, which resulted in at least 400 deaths. At the same time, whilst that war was going on, a number of these fighters began carrying out attacks against anti-Syrian Lebanese political officials across the country. And at one point, even the UN came out and specifically accused Syria of complicity in facilitating some of those attacks. Fatah al-Islam lost the battle in Nahr al-Bared. So what did they do? The fighters who were still alive went back to Syria again. Many of them felt resentful of the regime in Damascus for having essentially been manipulated into fighting a losing battle and been abandoned in that losing battle. So some of those fighters actually started carrying out attacks against the regime in Damascus, in Homs, and in Aleppo, but a vast majority of those attacks were never reported in the media. a gag order was placed by Damascus to prevent these attacks being reported. Except for those militants who went underground and started carrying out attacks. Again, the vast majority of them found themselves in Syria, and the regime found themselves in another security threat, with another security threat. So those fighters, again, with new arrivals who still wanted to make it to Iraq, were bussed back into Iraq again in 2007 and 2008. And by that time, at least 100 jihadist fighters were crossing with in Syrian buses, most of them funded by the government, were crossing from Syria into Iraq every month, approximately 100, which was a very significant rate that basically hadn't been seen since the start of the revolution. Injured Islamic State in Iraq commanders were given state-funded medical assistance in Damascus. And a number of the big names that we hear affiliated with both Al-Qaeda and ISIS today in Syria and Iraq received medical assistance for injuries sustained in Iraq in Damascus through 2007, 8, 9, and 10. So I hope I've painted somewhat of a picture of quite disturbing involvement of the Syrian military intelligence specifically, and then by extension, Bashar al-Assad's government or regime in Damascus in not only creating, but continuing to facilitate and grow Sunni jihadist militancy, especially in Iraq, but it obviously had knock-on effects not only in Syria, but also in Lebanon. And all of those knock-on effects were essentially in pursuit of Syria's foreign policy interests. I said in Lebanon because they still had various gripes and games to play, in a sense, against anti-Syrian figures in that country, and for obvious reasons in Iraq to fight against the US-led coalition. I've always got quite frustrated. There's been a number of senior officials here in Washington, in fact, who have said lately that we got the Syrian revolution all wrong. Bashar al-Assad was never our enemy all along. Why did we always assume that was the truth? I mean, literally nothing could be further from the truth. There is no way of measuring it, but I am certain that hundreds of American soldiers would still be alive had it not been for this facilitation of jihadist militancy in Iraq. ISIS today would be a shadow of itself. It probably wouldn't even exist in Syria if the regime hadn't allowed it to grow to the extent that it did in Iraq from 2003 to 2010. The very threats we face today, the fact that ISIS is the phenomenon that it is today, is precisely because of this facilitation that happened in those years. And it was very well known. US intelligence circles were well aware of what was happening. Many messages were sent between Washington and Virginia and Damascus during those years, but with very little effect. It's a key context to bear in mind when looking at this situation today. Another phrase I use in the book is that because of this context, the chickens finally have come home to roost in Syria. The kind of jihadist infrastructure that the Assad regime built in those preceding years, one could argue, are leading the fight in some areas of the country against the regime today. So not only did Syria become a fertile ground for jihadist militancy, or at least an opportunity to potentially exploit in 2011 when the protests began, but the infrastructure was so extensive that the second they made the decision to, all of the safe houses, all of the networks were there in place to activate very quickly. And that's exactly what happened. But ironically, not only did, let me rewind actually. Protests began in March 2011. By June 2011, several months after, the Islamic State in Iraq's deputy leader, who went by the name Haji Bakr, he was the deputy to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, essentially made a decision and proposed it to his boss that the Islamic State establish a Syrian wing. And this was in June 2011, May-June 2011. The decision was very quickly made that this was the right thing to do. This was an opportunity worth taking. And by August 2011, the ISI's chief commander in Mosul, the most important city for the group in the whole of Iraq by that point, a Syrian who goes by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, crossed into northeastern Syria in August 2011 with 6 other commanders, at least 2 of whom had received medical assistance in Damascus the year before. And as soon as they arrived in Syria, they activated the network and the infrastructure and the safe houses that had been there for 6-7 years already. And very quickly, what we have come to know as Jabhat al-Nusra was born, very, very quickly. And a primary reason for that, and again, this has a slight bit of irony to it, is that in the beginning months of the protest movement, the Assad regime released hundreds of Islamist prisoners from prison, saying it was a conciliatory measure to the opposition, but quite clearly it was a cynical ploy to taint the opposition as being Islamist and jihadist. Many of those people released in those early amnesties went on to establish not only Syrian Islamist opposition groups, but also the very early roots of both Jabhat al-Nusra and then later on ISIS. So quite ironically, the regime facilitated the growth of its own threat at the beginning, believing, I'm almost certain, that this would undermine the opposition. It would back up its argument to the world that it was fighting against a jihadist opposition and not a popular uprising. But as I say, certainly by the time of 2013, 2014, the chickens had very clearly come home to roost against the regime. I thought, just on a slight aside, another thing I found very interesting researching and certainly speaking with Syrians involved in the conflict has been the return of what I call the Hama generation. Hama city in Syria was the site of an uprising, primarily by a splinter movement from the Muslim Brotherhood in the early 1980s. And this was an uprising that the regime destroyed with no mercy, hence it being known as the Hama massacre. And a great deal of the most prominent families who had been involved in the beginnings of this uprising and then in Syria's broader Islamist movements at the time fled with their families. Many of them ended up in Saudi Arabia, some in Turkey, and some even in Europe. What's interesting in more recent years is how this Hama generation has returned. A great deal of them are often the sons of the fathers who were involved in the early 1980s and the late 1970s. Many of these sons actually went on to fight in places like Chechnya, in Bosnia, in Afghanistan, and I've come to know a number of people very specifically with this profile. Their fathers were involved in Hama and elsewhere. But what was really fascinating is that as young men, they went to fight for largely a transnational cause. They attached themselves to Al-Qaeda. They fought in places like Afghanistan. But as soon as the Syrian uprising started, this Hama generation, or at least many of them, went through a kind of transformative process whereby they actually ended up renouncing a lot of that international or transnational agenda for the sake of devoting themselves to more of a nationalist cause, albeit with an Islamist identity. And so one of the big findings, not only in my book, but more generally in my work on Syria, is the power of the Syrian identity. I don't think we've seen that kind of transformative process take place with other countries. But the power of the opportunity of returning to your homeland in Syria, where many of these sons hadn't been there since they were 6, 7, 8 years old, the power of returning to Syria to fight for your own country has actually overwhelmed and often defeated what that kind of transnational ideology that many of them had held before. And again, many of these individuals are playing a prominent role, certainly in the Islamist insurgency, but also many of them within the more jihadist elements. So to conclude, I have no idea how I'm doing on time. To conclude and bring it a little bit more up to the current day, I've given you some context about why the things have developed to the extent that they have today, and how they then developed from 2011. But where are we today, and what influence has the Syrian Jihad had, not only on Syria, but also the broader international security landscape? Syria has given birth to two competing models of jihadist militancy. Essentially, Syria proved a very successful test case for Al-Qaeda's new thinking about how to operate more durably within unstable societies. And of course, as is again very well known, Syria gave ISIS the opportunity to build its own new model, which it had obviously been working on for a number of years. So just to very briefly give you a picture of those two models. Al-Qaeda over the last maybe 6 to 7 years has been testing essentially a new way of operating on a local level in such a way as to grow durable roots within unstable societies. In other words, so that they can not only exploit a conflict or a revolution and temporarily grow and take advantage of it, but to actually last and stay there for many, many, many more years. Al-Qaeda's sort of first test case for this new strategic thinking, which had started to develop in around 2008, 2009, came in Yemen in 2010, 2011. They rebranded themselves Ansar al-Sharia. Al-Qaeda, AQAP, rebranded themselves Ansar al-Sharia and developed this new way of, they were trying to provide services to the civilians. They tried to restrict the extent to which they imposed harsh Islamic mores on the civilian population. But it failed in Yemen. Eventually, or too quickly, they imposed those very harsh norms that then turned the civilian population against them, which facilitated a sort of tribal and popular uprising, which teamed up with a Yemeni military effort in 2011. Mali was the second test case. We saw very quickly jihadists take advantage of the Tuareg uprising in Mali and very quickly take control of major urban centers in the north of that country. And again, they tried for a very short period of time, again, this new kind of behavior, if you like. But again, it failed because they imposed the harsh norms too quickly. When I say Syria has been the first successful test case, because Jabhat al-Nusra from at least mid-2012 was implementing this, what I call controlled pragmatism, very, very early on, and it's had a profound impact. Today, it's very, very difficult to find anyone within the, not only the armed opposition, but also many of the civilian sort of opposition structures in Syria who will condemn outright, certainly condemn publicly, Jabhat al-Nusra's role in supporting the revolution. And that's precisely because this group has temporarily done away with the kind of extremist, the kind of extremist behavioral norms that it expects the civilian population to abide by. And in here, we've seen a new kind of language developing. A lot of Al-Qaeda's senior strategists have started to talk about their areas of operation like children or babies. And they describe, for example, Mali as a baby. This is your baby. You can't expect it to know everything about how to live in a pure Islamic society from the moment of its birth, that birth meaning the arrival of Al-Qaeda into that area. So nurture it, socialize it, teach it the fundamentals before coming to the more harsh norms. And Syria, as I say, where we've seen that develop most successfully. And this is a very serious threat that we must be aware of, and I'm sure we'll probably come to it in the Q&A session. What's interesting is we're now seeing it replicated in Yemen, and again, very successfully. There's a main reason why you don't read a lot in the media about Al-Qaeda in Yemen these days. It's because they've embedded themselves so deeply within a popular revolutionary movement that it's very difficult to tell between who and who is not. Very briefly on ISIS. I've described ISIS as Al-Qaeda's obstreperous and brutally rebellious younger sibling. In a sense, ISIS was born out of Al-Qaeda. They were an Al-Qaeda affiliate. But they've taken on a totally new jihadist operating model, which is about acquiring and securing results now, as fast as possible, no matter the consequences. Little concern, if you take away ISIS propaganda, little concern is actually given to building up trust and relationships with civilian populations. It's much more about controlling people through force of arms and psychological intimidation. So we're seeing two very different models develop, and Syria has been pivotally important in allowing those two models to be tested. And now, arguably, you could argue, and many people do, that there are both have been successfully tested because both have shown significant results for jihadist militants in different areas. I certainly would argue in Syria's case, Al-Qaeda has much more durable roots. I think if ISIS faced a much more determined and locally representative adversary with international support, ISIS could actually be vanquished from a lot of its territory with relative ease. Al-Qaeda is much, much, much more difficult in that respect. And again, as I say, we can come into that in the Q&A session. So, final line. Whilst Al-Qaeda and ISIS both face significant challenges today, Syria will remain, globally, Syria will remain absolutely central to their future strategies. And in a sense, it's our responsibility to realize the centrality of Syria and not so much necessarily Iraq. And in that sense, amidst our almost obsession with the threat of ISIS, we must not take our eyes away from the threat that Al-Qaeda poses. This is the same organization or the same movement that carried out 9/11 and many other foreign attacks since. They still want to carry out attacks in our cities, and they are developing the almost perfect infrastructure in areas of Syria to potentially launch attacks like that further in the future. But their invisibility and their lack of big front page headlines should not mean we don't see them as a threat. And that's a key theme in my book, which I hope some of you may end up reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. Fascinating, very thought-provoking presentation, and an excellent book that I hope, as you said, many of you will buy and read. I'll pose a few questions while our audience formulates some questions of their own. Let me ask you first about the continuation of the relationship or not between the regime and some of these groups after the uprising started. You sort of left us off somewhere in sort of 2011. Obviously, at one level, the rise of ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra has been excellently instrumental for the regime, got the Russians in, got a lot of Western sympathy, weakened the opposition. We've heard reports in the past that there was still kinds of cooperation or at least accommodation. How would you describe the evolution or not of the relationship up till today between the regime and ISIS, regime and Jabhat al-Nusra?
That's a very good question. It's not entirely easy to answer, mostly just because of the sheer chaos of Syria has made it a little bit harder to sort of extract genuinely reliable information. But certainly, as I said in my presentation, the regime was directly complicit in facilitating the early growth by releasing so many prisoners, by giving them a free hand. So very early on, that was key. Since then, it's difficult. I mean, I'm hesitant to make any claim without some real evidence. Certainly, once ISIS became an active military actor in Syria, there was a very prolonged period of time whereby the regime was specifically carrying out intensive airstrikes against every single opposition actor everywhere in the country except ISIS. In a sense, giving it the free space to grow, to consolidate, and to prepare for further expansion. And that's probably the most obvious example and the most significant example of this kind of complicity. With Nusra, it's much more shadowy. I don't suspect, as of today, there is any link whatsoever between Jabhat al-Nusra and the regime. I mean, Nusra has presented itself very clearly as an anti-regime actor. ISIS is a much more blurry case. ISIS chooses to fight the regime when it wants to, but at other times the regime and ISIS very much leave each other alone. There have also been well-documented cases of the regime using certain middlemen to purchase ISIS-controlled gas sources. And in fact, one of those men has been sanctioned relatively recently by the United Nations for doing exactly that. There is another gas field in Homs, I believe, in the desert, which is actually currently being operated by Russian engineers answering to a company in Russia, but is controlled by ISIS. And so there are many more examples like this of this kind of either tacit agreement not to touch each other or actual open cooperation.
Mm-hmm. You described the rise of this jihadist network as initially very much regime engineered and, you know, before the revolution and so on, and now it's taken on a different face. How would you describe, I mean, beyond the regime machinations that enabled it to have a network and so on, and yet they've now drawn, at least Jabhat al-Nusra has, deep roots in the society. There, as you said, there are 10, such groups other than ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. Beyond what the regime did itself, what did you see transpire in 2011, 2012, 2013 that created a national or a social basis for these groups really to take root beyond some intelligence networks?
Well, I mean, there are many Syrians in this room, so and I know they'd undoubtedly agree with me when I say this, but Syrian society was definitely not set up to support jihadist militants. I mean, it was exactly the opposite. Anyone who'd ever traveled to Syria before would know that. So the regime complicity for that reason was important. I think what was interesting is when Jabhat al-Nusra first secretly established itself in late 2011, it actually didn't announce itself until January 2012, but when it became an overt and active sort of actor in the country, for the first 6 months or so, from about January 2012 to about July 2012, it was deeply unpopular within the opposition. In fact, there were many quite conservative Islamist sheikhs across the country and elsewhere who actually said, maybe Jabhat al-Nusra is a creation of the regime to undermine the revolution. There were many conspiracy theories going around that the regime had created this and that this wasn't part of the revolution. And the vast majority of Nusra's attacks early on in the revolution were big, spectacular urban suicide bombings that not only managed to hit a military or a security target, but killed civilians as well. So as I say, they were deeply unpopular. What happened to transform that was from about August 2012 onwards, Nusra had essentially grown to the extent to which it was no longer operating as a terrorist organization, but more as an insurgent organization. And that gave it the free hand to start embedding in revolutionary dynamics. So in about August 2012, Nusra had basically sent out emissaries to some of the most intense hotspots of the conflict to negotiate the formation of alliances, whereby Nusra and maybe 6 other groups from the local area would fight together on a front. And that was sort of the very beginnings of Nusra embedding itself within the revolution. And it did it successfully because it had the equipment and the money. By this time, it was receiving half of its funding from the Islamic State in Iraq. But it also had the military capability, which often at that point was quite superior to much of the more Syrian opposition. So it wasn't, what's developed today, and I'm always keen on emphasizing this, is not a relationship of like love or respect between the opposition and Nusra, but it's a relationship of dependence. You know, Nusra needs the opposition for its own credibility and to keep its roots. But the opposition needs Nusra because it feels like it hasn't got enough support from elsewhere, either on the ground or from the international community. And Nusra, whether we like it or not, has proven to be a very capable military adversary to the regime. And the opposition has no choice but to use that as an ally, as a tacit ally. But yes, I will re-emphasize and re-emphasize as many times as possible that that does not mean that they like Al-Qaeda. When you speak to these guys in private, they say a very different thing to the kind of image that you're painted in the public.
Thank you. You also mentioned a very interesting dynamic. You mentioned it about the Hamad generation, that between sort of transnational Sunni jihad and then coming home and having sort of a nationalist experience and how that affected or weakened the transnational thing. Can you point to, I mean, how does that translate, or does it translate? In fact, are certain groups, migrating from sort of the radical transnational position towards a more nationalist position that could be at some point accepted? Obviously, this is a very heated debate in Washington and Moscow where they look at all of these, some of them look at all of these groups as equally terrorists, and others saying, no, these are Islamists fighting a nationalist revolution. How have you seen that actually translate into something tangible in a particular group?
Sure. Well, that power of Syria transforming people from having a transnational vision to more of a nationalist one, that's best described in the case of Ahrar al-Sham. I mean, certainly in my experience, the vast majority of individual cases of that transformation find themselves as senior commanders in that group. Many of them some of them may have fought with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, so very recently. Others were veterans of the Afghan Jihad. Others fought in Bosnia and Chechnya and elsewhere. And, I can count at least on 2 hands the amount of senior military commanders within Ahrar al-Sham who have gone through that transformation. And they've described it to me. They've quite openly said, up until 5 years ago, I believed in international jihad. I believed in the whole agenda and objectives of everything that Al-Qaeda had sold to us. But when I was presented with the opportunity to come home for the first time in 35 years, something happened, something clicked. Is this still working?
Happened, yes,
So,
keep going, the microphones are on.
Something happened, something clicked in my head, And the draw of fighting for my homeland overwhelmed that kind of transnational cause that I'd always been sold elsewhere. And in fact, some of those commanders are working very quietly to undermine Al-Qaeda in Syria. And they have been for at least 18 to 24 months, precisely because they've seen both sides. And that's why I think Ahrar Sham is such a fascinating movement, because for a very long time, at least until recently, it has managed to very successfully toe the line between having portions of the group that are Salafi Jihadi, portions of the group who are Salafi, and others who are much more close to the Muslim Brotherhood. And barely any armed movement elsewhere in the world has really ever managed to sort of keep people on all three of those tangents together. Now, we might actually start to see that change soon. But certainly up until now, that's been a sort of fascinating example, certainly for me as
Thank
an
you.
analyst.
We're going to turn in a moment to the audience. I have one last question, a tough one, and then questions from the audience. Here we are in an election year in the U.S. People are thinking, well, how does the U.S., how do others confront these two different threats, as you said, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra? From your detailed research and work, what are the weak points? What are the areas that would be effective in constructing a successful strategy? You said defeating ISIS might be pretty, doable because they've isolated themselves from other groups. Defeating Al-Qaeda might, whether it's possible or not in Syria. What advice, what tips, what have you learned from your research that would help in a construction of a strategy?
Well, for ISIS, as I say, they're a very powerful, very military capable organization. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But they've shown themselves vulnerable to a concerted attack by a capable enemy. And the Kurdish YPG has certainly demonstrated that with US air support since strikes started in Syria in September 2014. The problem with that strategy is, I think, as far as I'm concerned, we've kind of reached the limit of how far that can go. And the problem that we now face is that the most powerful, most strategically important areas of ISIS control today in Syria are in Sunni heartlands. You can't send in Kurdish troops to go and fight a battle in Sunni heartlands without causing a whole new war. And actually, we've started to see that develop already. Kurdish YPG actually started carrying out attacks against US, I should say, just for the sake of clarity, American-supported YPG militia forces have started now carrying out attacks against American-supported opposition forces in northern Syria. By bolstering one party and kind of pulling away from the other, my big point to make in policy circles is we have created, and we may very well have created, a new conflict in northern Syria that might outlast the one between the opposition and the regime. This is not an ethnic conflict, I'm always keen to say, it's a political one. The YPG doesn't represent all Kurds, and the opposition is the first person to recognize that, because most of the groups that are fighting against the YPG in northern Aleppo have Kurds within their very top-level command structures. But nonetheless, by profoundly supporting one partner and almost pulling support from the other, we've created a massive political imbalance in northern Syria. With very profound implications on a regional level, not just for Syria. In terms of Al-Qaeda, it's going to be really difficult. I actually think that we've left it for so long, we have allowed them and given them the space to embed to such an extent, that actually declaring war on them as the West will be 100% detrimental, and it will only push more of the opposition into their hands. So ultimately, I fear we need to provide more support to the conventional opposition that do represent society. And by extension, that means people who identify themselves as Sunni Muslims and largely as Arabs in many areas of the country that's relevant to Nusra. But more importantly, I believe if that takes place, if the moderate or conventional opposition is allowed to flourish more than it has, ultimately Nusra is going to be forced into a corner where it's either going to lose a lot of its foot soldiers who say, the age of Al-Qaeda in Syria is over, or the group is going to split, or Nusra is going to come out and really show its true face, at which point an emboldened moderate or conventional opposition will turn against Nusra. But within current dynamics, there is no way the opposition will fight against the group, and there is no value in us trying to do it more than we already are.
Thank you very much, Charles. We'll take a few questions. Let me start at the very back.
Gareth Porter, independent investigative journalist.
You stand up.
Oh, sorry. First of all, congratulations on your book, which I've at least begun. I'm not going to say that I've finished it. It's an incredibly detailed work, and it's going to be preoccupying graduate students for many generations, I'm sure. You said, as I understood it, that there was a tacit cooperation between the US-supported opposition groups and al-Nusra Front. And I want to just probe a little bit further on that because of the increasing information that has now come out, and it has been acknowledged by the State Department spokesman a week ago or so, more than a week ago, that the two forces are commingled, at least frequently, some places. And so I wanted to ask you to address this question of the commingling geographically, I mean, in terms of the location of the forces, how closely are they, in fact, in how many places, and what are the implications of that?
Thank you. We'll take a couple more, and then the gentleman right there.
Kamran Bukhari, Program on Extremism at GW. Charles, congratulations for the great book. I'm looking forward to reading it, especially the bit about how the Assad regime cultivated it. It's something I was interested in. I actually wrote a piece back in '07 highlighting this threat. At the time, I didn't know at all it would become this big, and it's great work that you did and to bring that out. Question, Jabhat al-Nusra has a very organic relationship, for a lack of a better term, with Arar al-Sham. Now, Arar al-Sham is considered as a group that can be mainstreamed, brought into the political mainstream. Does that mean that we can extend that to sections of Jabhat al-Nusra?
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you very much. Michael Kurtzig, who used to work in the Middle East in the Department of Agriculture. Could you talk a little bit about the impact of total bedlam in this region on Jordan, on Lebanon, on Turkey? I assume Israel will take care of itself. What are the dangers there? And what does it mean there's a ceasefire orchestrated between the United States and Russia? Does that have any meaning at all? I mean, it sounds like a total balagan over there, so who knows who's who? Thank you.
Charles?
Excellent questions. The first one, if I had an hour, I could give you a much more accurate picture than I can in 2 minutes. But, you know, the most intensive intermingling of opposition forces and Nusra is in Idlib and portions of southern Aleppo now, not northern Aleppo. Idlib in particular is the most important case. Jabhat al-Nusra has invested a huge amount of resources in establishing Idlib as its key stronghold. For its you know, long border with Turkey and various other reasons. So that's, in terms of geographical area, that's where the focus of your attention should look. It is, you know, I mean, it's tacit cooperation in most cases. Sometimes it's more open. I mean, if we're looking at US-backed groups, only on rare occasions do those Free Syrian Army factions openly say that they are fighting alongside Nusra, not on an official channel. I mean, many of their commanders will say so, certainly, and they might mention it in interviews. But if you watch their official videos or read their statements, they don't normally say it. I think what was interesting is back when, I think it was March 2015, when this coalition in Idlib called Jaish al-Fatah was created to launch a big offensive in Idlib itself. That coalition contained no US-backed groups, or no, at the time, US-backed groups. What was interesting is that when Idlib city was captured, it had such a profound impact on the rest of sort of northern Syria that a good deal of the US-backed Free Syrian Army factions in Idlib basically made a case to their backers, and I wrote about this at the time, for involvement in that offensive. Otherwise, they risked losing influence and basically being overpowered by more Islamist groups. And they ended up getting essentially tacit permission from the US, Saudi, and other countries to be involved indirectly in those offensive operations. So they weren't actually fighting on the ground outside each town, but they were providing like rear guard support with their Tau missiles, the American anti-tank missiles, and with other like artillery and things like that. So they very much bought themselves in centrally to those operations. And so that's probably the best example on a significant level of why we are now where we are. And Idlib is such an intermingled area of tacit cooperation between those groups. There is also tension. There are also tensions between them. I should be very clear in making that. There have been some protests in the last few days in several villages in Idlib calling for the removal of Jabhat al-Nusra from villages that have traditionally been more aligned with the Free Syrian Army and thus with more US-backed groups. So it's not an entirely durable relationship, but certainly probably more durable than we'd like. Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham, Ahrar al-Sham, as I said, has sort of always fascinated me as a researcher because it's towed those lines that I was describing earlier. I do think maybe things might be changing. The Russian intervention has had a pretty profound impact. Ahrar's withdrawal from the political process has also had a pretty significant impact. And the group went through about 12 to 18 months of internal debate about exactly what it meant to be Ahrar al-Sham. Like, are we Salafi jihadis? Are we Salafis? Are we Syrian Islamists? Are we the Brotherhood? And that's where we started to see op-eds being written in the Washington Post and the Daily Telegraph in the UK. And that essentially was sort of the public face of the quote-unquote reformist faction within that movement. Unfortunately for us in the West, because I think that was an opportunity for us as the West to secure the group as not being the potential threat that it might be in the future. But unfortunately, they received very little attention from here, from the US. After those op-eds, there was still an awful lot of fear of engaging with the group on a top level. There's certainly engagement on a low level as it happens between aid organizations and various other things, but that was a big missed opportunity because now I think we're looking at a group that is more conservative than it could have been if we had essentially taken their olive branch and talked to them. No room for, we shouldn't have been providing them money or weapons or anything. All I'm advocating is talking. Simply for the sake of establishing a relationship is better than leaving them to Nusra, which is what we've done. It was between, well, the debate started in kind of mid-2013, and really it only ended like 3 months ago. And in terms of Nusra, just very briefly, it shouldn't be our responsibility, for practical reasons, to reach out to Nusra and try and either tear them apart or bring some of them into a political process. That will backfire. They will just reject us. Qatar, Turkey, maybe, they could be middlemen in that kind of thing. But so long as Ahrar al-Sham is not formally part of the political process, there's no chance Nusra will be, or any portion of them. So that's really the first step that has to be taken. Yes, I mean, I sort of unfortunately agree with your not rosy picture of the region. Yes, I mean, things undoubtedly are far more destabilized than we would like. I'm not an economist, but I actually think finance and economy is much more important when you're looking at countries like Jordan and Lebanon and elsewhere in terms of their long-term stability. I think that Jordan in particular certainly has the security capabilities to deal with threats, but the impact of continued flows of refugees into their country has had a profound economic effect on the country. Of course, that opens up various cleavages. The ceasefire, I think actually, without wanting to go into it in too much detail, I think most of us are very surprised about how long the ceasefire has lasted. It's a week today. Yeah, most people expect it to last half an hour. So one week is progress. And I've been really impressed by the restraint that people on the ground have shown, not retaliating. I mean, there have been many violations of the cessation of hostilities, but we've not seen a massive retaliation that would definitively break it down. And I think that's promising. I'm not sure if it will last the full 2 weeks, because tensions are rising a little bit. There have been a number of targeted strikes against specific groups that have basically come out and said, if we lose too much, we're retaliating. We have the right to self-defense. So we'll see. But I think the fact that it's lasted a week is a good sign. The worry is that the opposition High Negotiations Committee just recently came out about an hour ago and said that we cannot yet decide to attend the Geneva talks because the conditions on the ground still are not what we want them to be. So clearly we have more progress to make.
Thank you, Charles. Take the lady and then move that way.
Yeah, thank you. Céline Caro, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, a German political foundation here based in Washington. Can you tell us something about the American and European foreign fighters? How are they doing these days in Syria and Iraq? And what does it mean in terms of terrorist threat for the West in general? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman right behind you.
I'm Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and former diplomat. So I'm a little confused about the Shia-Sunni dynamics here. We have Shia-aligned Alawi sponsoring Sunni jihadis to suborn Sunni tribes in Al-Anbar to take on the infidel gringos and the Shia-aligned Iraqi army. And then after that chain, we have the Sunni jihadi coming back to roost. Is that correct? Did anybody in the Mukhabarat lose their head over this brilliant plan?
Thank you. The gentleman and then the lady behind him.
Thank you. Joel Tambusi. I don't have a title. I wanted to, I'm just an enthusiast. I wanted to ask, you mentioned the people here in Washington, and I've noticed a number of disturbing op-eds in Western press advocating for keeping Assad very strongly. Guys like Jeffrey Sachs and Kinzer, who are very intelligent guys, clearly. Very, I don't know, seeming to kind of set aside a lot of information to advocate for basically setting aside the opposition and going for Russia and Iran's agenda. I'm curious, why do you think they're embracing that kind of a narrative?
Thank you. No, the lady behind him.
Mona Alami, I'm a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council.
Could you stand up, Mona?
Yeah. Hi. I'm interested in knowing your viewpoint on what's going to happen with between Salafi jihadi groups or Salafi mujahid groups, as well as Salafi jihadi groups and opposition fighters, given the Russian policy now of containment to certain regions. How do you see the relation evolving? Do you see more cooperation, internal fighting, etc.?
Thank you. Charles?
Okay. European and American foreign fighters. I mean, I think there's certainly an indication that Western foreign fighters are still coming to Syria and Iraq, but certainly not on the scale that they used to be. I think looking at ISIS in particular, they are facing more pressure in Syria and Iraq than they have done certainly since the capture of Mosul. And some of that is showing or beginning to show within the movement itself, targeting quite on a sustained fashion, like their sources of finance, has seen the group halve fighter salaries, which, believe it or not, seems to have had quite a profound impact on morale, and various other things. So we are hearing more and more reports of internal divisions within the movement in certain key areas of Syria, and possibly also in Iraq. So that has an implication on the attraction of ISIS as for foreign fighters. But I think what we're also seeing, which is quite interesting, is that Libya is now becoming an attractive proposition for ISIL foreign fighters, from Europe in particular. And that might well be a sign of things to come. And certainly that would help explain why in a place like Washington, Libya is becoming more and more topical these days in terms of the threat posed by ISIS. So hopefully that goes like some way to answering your question. They're still coming. They're not necessarily facing the best conditions, certainly not as good conditions as they used to. The Shia-Sunni contradiction, well, I mean, I totally understand your cynicism. It has happened. I mean, it's fact. Welcome to the Middle East. Things aren't simple. And very often, Sunni, Shia, Alawi divisions don't matter. You know, like we have a tendency here in the West to look at the Middle East as inherently divided by sect. But in many occasions, it's just politics. And we shouldn't be overly obsessed with sectarianism. Sure, sectarianism is a serious issue today, and it has been in the past, but it doesn't define everything that happens in the Middle East. So the fact that a Ba'athist, not necessarily Shia or Alawi military officer, might choose to work with a Sunni jihadist militant is by far inconceivable, and that is basically what happened. So yeah, I totally agree with you. It does look very messy, but it's just the way that things are. Great question on the asset, whether, these recent articles, I mean, I've been profoundly frustrated by them, as many others have. I'm all for open, free opinions, especially ones that don't agree with me, but it's profoundly naive to think that leaving Assad to stay and teaming up with Russia is going to improve things on the ground. I mean, literally nothing could be further from the truth. The very fact that Assad is still there is the biggest attraction for many jihadists in Syria, in the region, and further afield. The fact that Russia has intervened is exactly what is helping Nusra further embed and further consolidate that relationship of dependence with the opposition. By giving them a free hand to do so, we are literally allowing our long-time adversaries, speaking of jihadists, to grow and gain more of an opportunity. The fact that we seem to have ignored Assad as being a problem, I just totally don't understand. I feel like policy these days is incredibly reactive, and a lot of that sort of revisionist commentary is also very reactive. And most of them just talk about what happened in the last few months, but they seem to have forgotten what happened since 2011, let alone what I talked about happening since 1999 or whatever. So the context is everything, and we can't let go of that. Otherwise, we'll be digging ourselves an even bigger hole than we are already in. Salafi Jihadi future, I just wrote that down and I've forgotten what the question was.
Muna, what was the question?
The relation between the various groups as well as with the opposition, given the Russian containment policy to certain areas, do you see consolidation or do you see further divisions?
Well, I think when Russia intervened, there was a lot of commentary saying that this was going to radicalize the opposition. And I think that's true, but it hasn't religiously radicalized the opposition. It's been a political radicalization, which I think is an important distinction to make. So the effect of Russia's intervention was that many sort of, conventional opposition fighters on the ground, they didn't start saying, oh, well, now I'm going to join Al-Qaeda, or, oh, now I believe in Al-Qaeda's vision, or even now I want to be a Salafi. They said, well, the West has abandoned us because Russia is now throwing cluster bombs on all of our villages indiscriminately. And it was a political radicalization of total abandonment from the rest of the world. Now, that is also an opportunity for Nusra. But I draw the distinction between religious and political radicalization for a reason. It doesn't mean that all of these young Syrian men suddenly are going to support Al-Qaeda's transnational cause. But it does push them politically into Nusra's being embedded within the revolution and being an acceptable partner, or even the only partner on the ground to work with. And that's the danger that we face, because we're not helping provide a credible alternative to that. Quick anecdote that I thought was being actually quite interesting in the last couple months is actually that Nusra has sought to take advantage of that kind of political radicalization or political abandonment, or the perception of abandonment within the more conventional opposition. Nusra's leader actually proposed a meeting in early January, and it was held between all of the main leaders of the Jaish al-Fatah alliance in Idlib. And in the meeting, Nusra's leader proposed a grand merger between all of those groups. And they went around the room, all of the leaders said, this is a good idea, we'll entertain it, let's talk about it. And they got round to Ahrar al-Sham, which arguably was the second most hardline group in the room, or third probably, sorry. And Ahrar al-Sham's leader said, no way, we'll never consider it unless you break your ties to Al-Qaeda. At which point the meeting ended and everyone left. About 3 to 4 weeks ago, Nusra's leader came back to those groups and said, okay, now we can place our allegiance to Al-Qaeda as a point for negotiation, but we're going to expect a lot of things back from you if this is going to work. So in other words, he's saying, well, we might be willing to break our ties with Al-Qaeda, but you have to give us a lot of good things in return. Personally, as a long-time follower of Nusra's leader, I don't ever think he'll do it. And even if he did, it wouldn't mean anything had changed. But it just goes to show how Nusra is seeking to exploit that political radicalization for its own benefit, to ensure its presence in Idlib for the long term.
Thank you. Last couple of questions. A lady in the back.
Hi. So to play the devil's advocate a little bit.
Could you introduce yourself and stand up? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kara. I just returned from living in Jordan for the past 2 years, so I have a different perspective from some. Basically talking with like the common citizen on the ground, many times they claim that the creation of ISIS is ultimately the United States' fault. So if you could just comment on that. And also in recent Russian strikes, they were very happy about this, claiming that it was a lot more effective than American involvement. So I would just like to hear your opinion.
Thank you. Yes, gentlemen.
Hi, my name is Kees Bouchard. I'm with the Syria Justice Accountability Center. My question is that Hafiz al-Assad, the father of Bashar, for a long time was very anti-Muslim Brotherhood, and he did everything in his power to stamp them out. What sort of triggered this change of strategy with the Bashar government towards co-opting jihadism? Thank you.
Thank you. Charles, that'll be the last round.
Great questions. ISIS is America's fault. It's a very easy argument to make. If Iraq hadn't been invaded, then Al-Qaeda in Iraq would never have grown to the extent that it did, if not even existed. I actually think it probably would have established itself in Iraq at some point. I mean, they had some critical mass in the north of the country. But certainly the occupation of Iraq gave Al-Qaeda in Iraq an opportunity to find a cause. And of course, that led to them actually becoming an Al-Qaeda affiliate, which is significant in and of itself. And as we know, Al-Qaeda in Iraq transferred to the Islamic State in Iraq, transferred to ISIS, transferred to today's Islamic State. So clearly, you know, the roots of transfer are very clear. So there's an argument to be made that, yes, the invasion of Iraq was a big mistake, and it has had pretty profound consequences. But at the same time, as I say, I still think Al-Qaeda in Iraq would have established itself in some way in northern Iraq. They would have found another cause to attach themselves to, but certainly they would be a shadow of themselves, a tiny shadow of themselves than what they are today. As to thinking Russia's strikes are effective, I mean, well, it entirely depends what these people think that should be targeted, but what should be targeted. I mean, the Institute for the Study of War has done some great mapping, Jenny's in the crowd, done some great mapping of Russian airstrikes since it started, and there is, it's kind of incontrovertibly true that the vast majority of Russian airstrikes have targeted the normal opposition. And ISIS has got away pretty clean from Russian airstrikes. And so it's just patently false to say that, or for these people to say that Russian airstrikes are more effective against ISIS because they've barely targeted them. So that's just another case, I guess, of just, you know, popular perception being somewhat misled, perhaps by media, I don't know. The Hafiz Bashar, I don't think there is necessarily any single answer. It kind of feeds into the same answer I was giving earlier about the Shia, Sunni, Alawi thing. Like I kept emphasizing Syrian military intelligence because they were leading this policy. You know, it was a security-oriented policy. Obviously, it had Bashar's sign-off. I'm sure, theoretically, if the Middle East looked differently and there was Shia armed groups that the Assad regime could have backed to fight the Americans, they would have done so early on. But obviously, that took form later. So I would argue it was more opportunistic. I mean, but you can also look at the policies of both Hafez, certainly as far as I'm aware, and I describe some of this in my book, going back to Hafez al-Assad's time in power, and in Bashar al-Assad's power, they actually wavered between how supportive or not they were, or how willing they were to allow over Islamic practice to exist. And both of them wavered to some extent. And if you look in Iraq, you know, Saddam Hussein was like a secular Ba'athist, just like the Assads. But prior to the Iraq invasion, several years prior, Saddam Hussein created, and his Mukhabarat created, a policy of basically instilling Salafist ideas into the Iraqi army and into the Republican Guard. You could equally have said, well, why would he have done that? Because he was a profound Ba'athist believer in secular governance. So there are always contradictions here, but there's always a reason for it. Saddam did it because he feared that the Brotherhood and Islamists in general were going to rise up against him, so he chose to take a stranglehold of them for his own use. Equally, I think Bashar did exactly the same thing. something was growing within his territory that was a potential threat. So he chose to take a stranglehold of it, essentially buy some of the senior figures, put them in his intelligence apparatus's pocket, and use them for his own interests. And as I say, he did so with remarkable success.
Well, please join me in thanking Charles. This is an excellent book, excellent presentation.